Hello, everybody. Ooh, that was a rough startup. I'm so sorry. I've been trying to do a lot more voice acting, and I've been applying for spots. So, which there's a chance I won't make it. There's tons of people after these jobs, but if you ever need a voice actor, if you need my crappy voice to flood your ears, spread the word and let people know that I'm definitely down to do almost anything, just because I think it's fun. We are gonna get right into this. It'd be cool to be into a FNAF game. As we're getting into this. We gotta get into chapter 2. So, here we go. The pencil squeaked against the paper as the man at the desk carefully filled out the form in front of him. He paused suddenly, a wave of dizziness overtaking him. The letters on the page were fuzzy, and he adjusted his reading glasses, his head swimming. The glasses made no difference, and he took them off and rubbed his eyes. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the sensation was gone. The room righted itself, and the words on the page was perfectly clear. He scratched his beard, still disconcerted, then began to steadily write again. A ring sounded and the front door opened. "Yes, sir," he barked without looking up. I wanted to have a look around the yard," a woman's voice echoed softly. Oh, pardon me, ma'am." The man looked up and smiled momentarily, then went back to his form, writing as he talked. "Scrap is 50 cents a pound. It might be more if you find a specific part, but we can see when you come back in. Just go have a look around. You have to bring your own tools, but we can help you load it up when you're ready to leave." "I'm looking for something specific." The woman peered down at him, observing his name tag. "Bob," she added belatedly. "Well, I don't know what to tell you." He set his pencil down, then reclined and crossed his arms behind his head. "It's a dump," he laughed. "We try at least to separate the junk cars from the tin cans. But what you see is what you get. Bob, you received several truckloads of scrap metal on this date and from this location." The woman set a piece of paper down on top of the form Bob had been working on, and he picked it up and adjusted his reading glasses, then looked up at her over them. "Well, as I said, it's a dump," he said slowly, growing more concerned as the moments passed. "I might be able to point you in the right direction. I mean, we don't catalog this stuff." The woman walked around the side of the desk, stepping up beside Bob's chair, and he straightened nervously in his seat. "I hear you boys had some trouble here last night," she said casually. "No trouble," Bob furrowed his brows. "Some kid snuck in. It happens." "That's not what I heard." The woman studied a picture on the wall. "Your daughters?" she asked lightly. "Yes, 2 and 5. They are beautiful." She paused. "Do you treat them well?" Bob was taken aback. "Of course I do," he said, trying to hide his indignation. There was a long pause. The woman tilted her head, still looking at the picture. "I heard you called the police because you thought someone was trapped in the scrap heaps out here," she said. Bob didn't answer. "I heard," the woman continued, leaning in closer to the picture, "that you thought you heard screaming and sounds of distress and panic. Something was trapped. A child was trapped, you thought. Maybe several? Look, we run a clean business and we have a good reputation. I'm not disputing your reputation. Quite the opposite. I think what you did was honorable. Running to the rescue in the middle of the night, cutting your legs on jagged scraps of metal as you ran blindly through the yard. How do you..." Bob's voice trembled and he stopped talking. He moved his leg under the desk, hoping to hide the bandage that bulged out visibly under both pants legs. "What did you find?" the woman asked. He didn't answer. "What was there?" she pressed. "When you got on your hands and knees and crawled through the beams and the wires, what was there?" "Nothing," he whispered. "Nothing was there." "And the police? They found nothing?" "No, nothing. There wasn't anything. I went out again today just to be..." He spread his hands on the desk in front of him, collecting his nerves. "We run a good business," he said firmly. "I don't feel comfortable talking about this. If I'm in some kind of trouble, then I think you're not in any trouble, Bob, as long as you can do me one little favor. What's that? Simple. The woman leaned over Bob, bracing herself on the arms of his chair. So close her face almost touched his. Take me there. John pulled into the parking lot at the construction site and immediately saw Oliver standing in front of the gate of the chain-link fence. His arms were crossed and he was chewing on something, his face grim. When it became clear that he wasn't going to move out of the way, John slowed to a stop and got out. What's going on? He asked. Oliver continued to chew on whatever was in his mouth. I have to let you go, he said at last. You're late. Again. I'm not late, John protested, then glanced at his watch. I mean, not by much, he amended. Come on, Oliver. It won't happen again. I'm sorry. Me too, Oliver said. Good luck, John. Oliver, John called. Oliver let himself in through the gate and glanced back one more time before walking away. John leaned against his car for a moment. Several co-workers were staring at him, suddenly turning away as John noticed them. John got in his car and headed back the way he had come. When he returned to his apartment, John sat down at the edge of his bed and buried his face in his hands. Now what? He wondered aloud and glanced around the room. His eyes lit on his only decoration. You still look terrible, he said to Theodore's disembodied head, and you're still in worse shape than me. The notion of attending the party that night suddenly returned to him. The thought of it set off nervous flutters in his stomach, but he wasn't sure what it was. Anxiety? Excitement. I thought she was dead too, Jessica had said the night before. I've seen her. I've talked to her. It is her. John closed his eyes. What if it is her? He saw it again. The moment he always saw. The shuddering suit. Charlie trapped inside it as it crunched and jerked, and then her hand, and the blood. She couldn't have survived that. But another image came to mind. Unbidden. Dave, who became Springtrap. He had survived what happened to Charlie. He had worn the yellow rabbit suit like it was a second skin, and had paid for it twice. The scars that covered his torso like a shirt of gruesome lace told the story of one narrow escape. And the second, Charlie had killed him when she tripped the spring locks, or so they all believed. No one could have survived what they saw, and yet he had returned. For an instant, John pictured Charlie scarred and broken, yet miraculously alive. But that doesn't sound like the person Jessica saw, John spoke clearly to Theodore. Someone broken and scarred. That's not who Jessica was describing. He shook his head. That's not the person I saw at the diner. The next day, she looked like she'd just stepped out of a fairy tale. John caught himself and shook his head, trying to focus on the present. He really didn't know what had happened to Charlie. He felt himself edging towards the glimmer of hope. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe she's all right. It was what he'd wished for what anyone wishes for, in the throes of grief. Let it not have happened. Let everything be all right. The precarious ledge became solid ground, and John felt a weight lifted, his neck and shoulders relaxing from a cramped position he had not been aware of. The fatigue from so many months of misspent sleep caught up to him all at once. He looked at Theodore. He was clutching the rabbit's head so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. He slowly released the toy, propping it up on the pillow. I'm not going, he said. I was never really considering it. I just wanted Jessica to leave me alone. He held his breath for a moment, then let out a deep sigh. Right? He said, his tone becoming more agitated. What would I even say to these people? Theodore stared at him blankly. Damn, John sighed. The fluttering in John's stomach grew worse the closer he came to Clay's house. He checked the dashboard clock. It was only 6. Maybe no one would be there yet, he thought. But as he made his way down the winding road towards their house, cars lined both sides of the street for half a block. John wedged his car between a pickup truck and a rusted sedan almost as beat up as his own, then got out and headed towards the house. All the windows of the 3-story house was illuminated, standing out against trees like a beacon. John hung back, staying out of sight. He could hear music from inside and laughter. The sound of it made him balk. He forced himself to walk the rest of the way to the door, but he stopped again when he reached it. Going inside felt like an enormous decision, something that would change everything. Then again, so did walking away. He raised his hand to ring the doorbell, then hesitated. Before he could decide, the door swung open in front of him. John blinked at the sunlight and found him face to face with Clay Burke, who looked as startled as he was. John! Clay reached out and gripped John with both arms, pulled him in, and gave him a hug, then quickly pushed him back to where he started, and firmly patted his shoulders. Right, come on in. Clay stepped back to clear the way, and John followed him in, looking around the room cautiously. The last time he was here, the whole house had been a wreck, strewn with signs of a man falling to pieces. Now the piles of laundry and evidence files were gone, the couches and the floor were clean, and Clay himself was beaming with a genuine smile. He caught John's eye, and his grin faded. A lot has changed, he smiled as though reading John's mind. Is Betty? John broke off too late. He shook his head. Sorry, I didn't mean to. No, she's still gone, Clay said evenly. I wish she'd come back. Maybe she will someday, but life goes on, he added with a brief smile. John nodded, uncertain what to say. John! Marla waved from the stairs and immediately came bounding with her usual eagerness, wrapping him in a hug before he could so much as say hello. Jessica appeared, coming in from the kitchen. Hey, John, Jessica said more calmly, but with a glowing smile. I'm so glad to see you again. It's been a long time, Marla said, releasing him at last. Yeah, he said, too long. He tried to think of something else to say, and Marla and Jessica exchanged a glance. Jessica opened her mouth about to speak, but was interrupted as Carlton ran excitedly down the staircase. Carlton! John called with his first genuine smile of the evening. Carlton raised his hand in an answering wave and came to join the group. Hey, he said. Hey, John echoed as Carlton tousled John's hair. What are you, my granddad now? John made a half-hearted effort to straighten his hair while searching the crowd with his eyes. I'm surprised you came, Marla slapped him across the shoulder. I mean, of course you were going to come, Carlton corrected. I just know you've been busy. Too many girlfriends, am I right? How's New York? John asked, fishing for something to talk about as he straightened his clothes. Great. College, city, learning, friends. I was in a play about a horse. It was great. He bobbed his head in a rapid nod. Marla's in school, too. In Ohio, Marla jumped in. I'm preemed. That's great, John grinned. Yeah, it's been a lot of hard work, but it's worth it, she said cheerfully, and John began to relax, falling back into the familiar pattern of their friendships. Marla was still Marla. Carlton was still inscrutable. Is Lamar around? Carlton asked, looking from face to face. Marla shook her head. I called him a few months ago, she said. He's on track to graduate early. But he's not coming, Carlton persisted. Marla smiled slightly. He said, I'm never, ever, ever setting foot in that town again. Not ever, ever, never for as long as I live, and you shouldn't either. But he said we're all welcome to visit him. In New Jersey, Carlton made a skeptical face and turned his attention to Jessica. Jessica, what's up with you these days, anyway? I heard you got the dorm room to yourself now. John stiffened, suddenly aware of what Carlton was really asking. The light seemed blinding, the noise louder. Jessica glanced at John, but he didn't acknowledge her. Yeah, she said, turning back to the others. I don't know what happened, but I came home one day right after about 6 months ago, and she was packing what she could carry. She left me and John to clean up the rest. If we hadn't happened to walk in, I don't think she was even going to tell me she was leaving. Did she say where she was going? Marla asked, her brows furrowing. Jessica shook her head. She hugged me and said she'd miss me, but all she'd say was she had to leave. She wouldn't tell me where. Well, we can always ask her, Carlton said. John looked at him startled. You've seen her? Carlton shook his head. Not yet. My plane just got in today, but she'll be here tonight. Jessica says she looks good. Right, John said. They all looked at him as if they could see what he was thinking. She looks good, but she doesn't look like Charlie. John, come help me in the kitchen, Clay called, and John broke away from the group relieved, but also fully aware he couldn't possibly provide any help in the kitchen. What's up? He asked. Clay leaned back against the sink and looked him up and down. Need me to open the ketchup bottle? John asked, growing nervous. High shelf? Clay sighed. I just want to make sure you're all right out there. What do you mean? I thought you might be nervous. I know it's been a while since you and Charlie talked. It's been a while since you and I've talked, too, John said, unable to keep the edge out of his voice. Well, that's different and you know it, Clay said dryly. I thought you might need a pep talk. A pep talk? John retorted. Clay shrugged. Well, do you? Clay stared at him firmly, but with kindness in his eyes, and John's nerves calmed. Jessica told you? He asked, and Clay tilted his head to the side. Some, probably not all. Here. Clay opened the refrigerator door he had been leaning against and handed John a soda. Try to relax. You're here with friends. These people out there love you, Clay smiled. I know, John said, setting the can on the countertop next to him. He eyed it for a second but did not pick it up, feeling like if he drank it, he would be giving in, accepting everything he was told. It'd be like taking whatever pill everyone else had already swallowed. John eyed the back door. Don't even think about it, Clay said abruptly. John didn't try to pretend it wasn't what he was thinking. Clay sighed. I know how hard this must be for you. Do you? John responded sharply, but Clay's expression didn't change. Stay and talk to her. I think you owe her that, and to yourself. John's eyes were still fixed on the door. All of this heartache that you're putting yourself through, that can't be what you want, Clay leaned to the side, interrupting John's gaze. You're right, John said. He stood up straight and met Clay's eyes. This isn't what I want. He went to the back door and pushed it open, rushing down the concrete steps as though Clay might pursue him, then walking around the side of the house towards his car, his heart pounding. He felt a little lightheaded and completely unsure he was making the right decision. John, someone called from behind him. The familiar voice sent a jolt through him, and he stopped, closing his eyes for a second. He heard her heels tapping on the stone wall, the sound vanishing as she crossed the grass to him. He opened his eyes and turned towards the voice. She was standing a few feet from him. Thanks for stopping, Charlie said. Her face was anxious, her arms wrapped slightly across her body like she was cold, despite the mild weather. I was just going to get my jacket, John said, trying to sound casual in the midst of an obvious lie. He looked her up and down, and she didn't move, like she knew what he was doing, and why. It's not her. She looked like some stunning cousin of Charlie's, maybe, but not her. Not the round-faced, frizzy-haired, awkward girl he had known almost all his life. She was taller, thinner, her hair longer, darker. Her face was uncannily different, though he could not have explained how. Her posture, even as she stood hugging herself in anxiety, was somehow elegant. As he looked at her, the first shock of recognition gave way to the acute revulsion he took. He took an involuntary step back. How can anyone think that's her, he thought. How can anyone think that's my Charlie? She bit her lip. John, say something, she said pleadingly in her voice. He shrugged, holding both hands up in resignation. I don't know what to say, he admitted. She nodded. She uncrossed her arms as if she just realized she was holding them that way, and began to pick at her nails instead. I'm so happy to see you, she said, sounding like she was about to cry. John softened, but tampered the feeling down. Me too, he said in monotone. I missed you, she began, searching his face for something. John had no idea what he might look like, but he felt like stone. I had to get away for a while. She went on uncertainly. That night, John, I thought I was going to die. I thought you did, he said, trying to swallow the lump rising in his throat. She hesitated. You don't think I'm me? She asked softly, at last. He looked down at his feet for a moment, unable to say the words to her face. Jessica told me, it's okay, John, she said. I just want you to know that it's okay. Her eyes were bright with tears. His heart lurched, and in an instant, the world came into a different focus. He gazed at the woman huddled in front of him, trying to suppress her sobs. The stark differences he saw in her were suddenly things that seemed so easily explained. Her shoes had heels, so she was taller. She was wearing a form-fitting dress instead of her usual jeans and a t-shirt, so she appeared thinner. She was wearing elegant clothing, and her gestures were confident, sophisticated, but it was all no more than if Jessica had given her the makeover she was always threatening. No more than if Charlie had grown up. We all had grown up. We all had to grow up. John thought of the way he drove home from work, or had until this morning, the way he avoided ever driving past her house, or the sight of Freddy Fazbear's. Maybe Charlie had things she wanted to avoid. Maybe she just wanted to be different. Maybe she wanted to change like you did. And when you think of that moment, what it did to you, what must it had done to her? What kind of nightmares do you have, Charlie? He was seized by a sudden visceral desire to ask her, and for the first time he allowed himself to meet her eyes. His stomach jolted as he did, his heart racing. Tentatively, she smiled at him, and he smiled back, unconsciously mirroring her, but something frigid twitched inside him. Those aren't her eyes. John shifted his gaze, a calm coming over him. Charlie looked momentarily confused. Charlie, John said carefully, do you remember the last thing I said to you before you were trapped in the suit? She held his gaze for a moment, then shook her head. I'm sorry, John, she said. I don't remember a lot about that night. Whole pieces are just missing. I remember being in the suit. I passed out, I think, for hours. So you don't remember, he repeated gravely. It seemed impossible that she could have forgotten. Maybe she didn't hear me. Were you hurt? He asked brusquely. She nodded silently, her eyes filling again with tears, and she hugged herself. This time she didn't look cold. She looked like she was in pain. Maybe she was. John took a step closer to her, wanting suddenly, desperately, to promise her that everything would be all right. But then her eyes met his again, and he stopped and stepped back. She extended a hand, but he didn't take it, and again she crossed her arms over her body. John, would you meet me tomorrow? She asked steadily. Why? He said before he could stop himself, but she did not react. I just want to talk. Give me a chance. Her voice rose shakily, and he nodded. Sure, yeah. I'll meet you tomorrow. He paused. That same place, okay? He added carefully, waiting to see how she would reply. The Italian place? Our first date? She said easily and gave a gentle smile. Her tears seemed to have stopped. Around 6. John let out a deep breath. Yeah. He met her gaze again and did not look away, letting himself take rest in her eyes for the first time that night. She looked back at him, motionless, like she was afraid she might scare him away. John nodded, then turned and left without another word. He walked quickly back to his car, struggling to keep his pace even. He felt like he had done something wonderful, and also like he had made a horrible mistake. He felt strange, riding an adrenaline rush, and as he drove through the dark, he pictured her face again. Those weren't her eyes. Charlie watched him go, rooted to the spot as if it were the only place she ever stood. He doesn't believe me. Jessica had not wanted to tell her about John's strange yet adamant conviction, but his refusal to speak to her now, his unwillingness even to acknowledge her presence that day in the diner, was too bizarre to be dismissed. How can he think I'm not me? The taillights of John's car vanished around a bend. Charlie stared into the dark where he had been, not wanting to return to the bright, noisy house. Carlton would tell her a joke. Jessica and Marla would comfort her the way they had in the diner that day, when she had come to show them that somehow, impossibly, she had survived. The walk from her car, really, Aunt Jen's borrowed car, towards the diner had felt like miles that day. Her stomach fluttering anxiously, even though she knew, of course, that they would be happy to see her. How could they not be? Every step was stiff, uncertain. Every time she moved, it hurt. Her body sore all over from the day before, though there were no marks on her to show it. Even breathing was strained and unfamiliar, and she had a persistent feeling that if she forgot to do it, she would die of asphyxiation right there on the pavement, unless she was reminded. Take a breath. She could see them through the window as she made her way to the front of the diner, her heart racing, and then they saw her. It was everything she had dared to hope. Marla and Jessica ran to the door, jostling over who could hug her first, crying at the sight of her living face. She let herself be wrapped in the warmth of their relief, but before they even let her go, she was looking for John. When she saw him, his back was to the door. She almost called out his name, but something stopped her. He said something she could not hear, and she watched incredulously as he failed to come to her, clenching a spoon in his hand like a weapon. "John," she called at last, but he did not turn around. Marla and Jessica ushered her out of the restaurant, making reassuring sounds that must have been words, and Charlie strained to see him through the window. He had not moved. How can he pretend I'm not here? A shock of pain hit her suddenly, yanking her back to the present, and Charlie hugged herself tightly, though it didn't really help. It was everywhere, sharp and hot. She clenched her jaw, unwillingly to make a sound. Sometimes it eased so an ache she could push to the back of her awareness. Sometimes it vanished for days at a time, but it always came back. "Were you hurt?" John had asked, the only sign he'd given that he might still care. And she had been unable to reply. "Yes," she could have said. "Yes, I was, and still am. Sometimes I think I'll die of it. And what I feel now is just an echo of what it used to be. It feels like all my bones are broken. It feels like my guts are twisted and torn. It feels like my head has cracked open, and things are leaking out. And it happens again and again." She clenched her teeth, taking deliberate breaths, until it began slowly to recede. "Charlie, are you okay?" Jessica said quietly, appearing beside her on the sidewalk outside Clay's house. Charlie nodded. "I didn't hear you come over," she said hoarsely. "He doesn't mean to hurt you. He's just traumatized," Charlie snapped. "I know." Jessica sighed, and Charlie shook her head. "Sorry, I didn't mean to be rude." "I know," Jessica said. Charlie sighed, closing her eyes. "He's not the one who died, and it did feel like dying." She could only remember that crucial night in fragments. Her thoughts were all scraps and whispers, hazy and muddled, everything circling slowly around a central point. The single, unmistakable snapping sound of the spring locks. Charlie shivered and felt Jessica's hand touch her shoulder. She opened her eyes, looking helplessly at her friend. "I think he just needs time," Jessica said gently. "How much time can he need?" Charlie asked, and the words sounded like stone. And that's the end of chapter 2. I hope you guys are enjoying. I'm sorry there was a little bit of a delay. I got super busy, and then, of course, my videos, I kind of recorded in advance. I could record some reading in advance. I just honestly forgot. But until then, I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.